Well, good morning to each one this morning. I enjoyed the service so far. I enjoyed what Sister Judy and Brother Mark had to share this morning. Even though I feel like I don't know both of you very well, I will endeavor to remember you in prayer as you follow God where He leads you, and trust that God will bless your life and service in the service where you find yourself. I'm not sure why God led this morning the way He has, but I guess we as a group this morning need to hear a lot on finding rest. I did not realize what your Sunday school lesson was about until last evening. Someone was talking about it. And you can open your Bibles to a very familiar chapter in John chapter 10. You Bible readers, you know what this chapter is. It's on the Good Shepherd. Title of the message is Finding Life in the Good Shepherd. We can ask the question, what is life? I think we've been introduced to that already, and some with the testimonies this morning. In James 4, verse 14, it says, "Whereas ye know not what shall be on the morrow, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away." We understand that this verse is talking about physical life. A physical life passes so quickly. I don't consider myself very old, but when you, at least for myself, when you reach the age of 40, I remember thinking back when I was in my 20s, I had an uncle that we had a 40th birthday party for, and I thought that seemed pretty old. But when I reached 40, it didn't seem quite so old. But nevertheless, we are passing through life, and life is short. But this morning, the life that we're talking about is much deeper than physical life. It goes far beyond the physical life. We are talking about a spiritual life that not only is for the future, but it begins now. And I would like to read the first 18 verses of John chapter 10, and I'd like to think about the shepherd and the sheepfold. Verse 1 of John 10 says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that entereth not in by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. For to him the porter openeth, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calleth his own sheep by name, and leadeth them out. And when he putteth forth his own sheep, he goeth before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. And a stranger will they not follow, but will flee from him, for they know not the voice of strangers. This parable spake Jesus unto them, but they understood not what things they were which he spake unto them. Then said Jesus unto them again, Verily, verily, I say unto you, I am the door of the sheep. All that ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved, and shall go in and out, and find pasture. The thief cometh not, but for to steal, and to kill, and to destroy. I am come, that they might have life, and they might have it more abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. But he that is an hireling, and not the shepherd, whose own the sheep are not, seeth the wolf coming, and leaveth the sheep, and fleeth, and the wolf catcheth them, and scattereth the sheep. The hireling fleeth, because he is an hireling, and careth not for the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and know my sheep, and am known of mine. As the Father knoweth me, even so I the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold, and one shepherd. Therefore doth my Father love me, because I lay down my life, that I might take it again. No man taketh it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. This commandment have I received of my Father." Now, to get this setting, I'd like to go back to chapter 8 of the book of John. In the first 11 verses of chapter 8, we have the account here of the woman that was taken in adultery. And we know the story, how that the leaders, the scribes and Pharisees, brought this woman to Jesus who was taking in adultery, and they were trying to find a trap for Jesus. And in verse 5, they tell Jesus what the law of Moses says, and they wonder what his response would be. And we see his response in verse 7. You know, this woman was trying to find life apart from God's will. She was involved in a sinful lifestyle. She was trying to find fulfillment on her own terms. She was trying to find life on her own terms. And verse 11 of chapter 8 always stands out to me. The forgiveness that Jesus gave this woman, but it was not simply a forgiveness and then he stopped. But he said, "Neither do I condemn thee, go and sin no more." It was a forgiveness and a command. It was a forgiveness of sin, but it was a command to go out and to live a holy life. In other words, to find a life apart, different from what she had. Find a life that was holy. Find a life that was according to the will of God. Verses 12 through 59 of chapter 8, we find that Jesus had this discourse with the Jews, and they were trying to debate Jesus and how all that went. Until finally the last verse of chapter 8, the Jews were so perplexed and so upset that they tried to stone Jesus. And then Jesus left, and immediately, what did he do? He found a blind man that had been blind since birth. And we see that in chapter 9. And again, he ministered to the needs of this blind man. And that no doubt this blind man was living life the best he knew under his circumstances. But when Jesus came, it changed his life. It gave him a new life. A new life. At the start, it was a drastic difference in his life physically. But again, we see there is a command that Jesus gave this blind man. He made clay and put it on his eyes, but he also gave him a command to go and to wash. It was talked about in Sunday school this morning, at least in the men's class, how that there is a need for obedience. Here, Jesus met two different individuals. And in order for them to have a life that was blessed by him, and that was a life of meaning, there was obedience that was required. This man, both of them, as they obeyed, they found new life. They found, as this blind man went and washed that clay off of his eyes, his eyes received sight. In verse 25 of chapter 9, after he received sight, the people were questioning, like, is this the same man that was blind? And they had called in his parents, and his parents gave their response, and how that they said, for fear of the Jews, verse 22, these words spake his parents because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. And then verse 25, they brought this man in, and they asked him who healed him. And he answered and said, whether he be a sinner or no, I know not. One thing I know, that whereas I was blind, now I see. The facts were there. He did see. He was blind. As far as who Jesus was, I find it interesting that at this point he did not know who Jesus was. I don't know where Jesus went. He made the clay, and then after he obeyed, Jesus must not have been around. But he nevertheless he realized what had happened in his life. In verses 37 through 38, Jesus came and showed himself to the blind man, that the man he had just healed, and verses 35 through 38. And I like his response. In verse 35, Jesus heard that they had cast him out. This man had been cast out of the temple because he had believed on, or he had given credit to Jesus for his healing. And in verse 35, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, and said unto him, Dost thou believe on the Son of God? And he answered and said, Who is he, Lord, that I might believe on him? And Jesus said unto him, Thou hast both seen him, and it is he that talketh with thee. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshipped him. The response of the blind man is beautiful. His faith. And then Jesus continued to engage with the Pharisees and to try to teach them who they really were in the verses that followed in chapter 9. And then he gets down into chapter 10. Immediately he goes into chapter 10. And Jesus said, I am the door. I am the shepherd. You know, this illustration of sheep and being a shepherd was something that the Jews were very familiar with, and one that they could easily relate to. And it is said that oftentimes in the Middle Eastern culture, at that time anyway, the shepherds had all their sheep named, and each sheep knew their name and also knew the voice of the shepherd. And it stands out to me as we think about the illustration of this parable, as we think about Jesus comparing you and I to sheep, and he as the shepherd. So what are some things we see in this passage? What are some things that we read in the first 18 verses of chapter 10? Well, number one, Jesus is the door. He is the door to the sheepfold. Christ is the shepherd. There is a sheepfold. There are sheep. And there are thieves, strangers, and hirelings. There is pasture, and there is life. So what are some characteristics? If Jesus compares us to sheep, what are some characteristics that sheep have that possibly could apply to you and I this morning? Number one, sheep are dependent on the shepherd for their direction. Sheep are followers. Does that sound anything like you and I this morning? Do you consider yourself a follower? Do you consider yourself a sheep? We look out, as we observe humanity, how often do people follow someone else? We see the different fads. We see the different things that come in and out. And sometimes, at least, there are individuals that people think that are popular, that think are important. They try to copy, whether it be the way they live, the way they dress, whatever it might be. People follow someone. And I think you and I are the same way. We tend to follow someone. In eastern Turkey, it was some years ago, the country of Turkey, there was a group of shepherds that left their sheep unattended for some time while they ate a meal. And I'm not sure what happened, but there were something happened to the sheep that made one of the sheep jump over a cliff. And it is said that first one, that after he jumped, it must have been quite a group of sheep there, and the sheep continued to jump over this cliff, a very high cliff, to their destruction. They said till it was all over, there was 1,500 sheep that went over this cliff. 450 sheep died. Many were saved because of those that had fallen first, that cushioned the fall of those that fell afterwards. And we ask the story, how could sheep do this? Why would they do that? Why wouldn't they stop? They see others that were going over the cliff. Well, I think too often we are a little bit the same way. We left to ourselves, we blindly follow, don't we? And in Isaiah 53, verse 6, it says, "All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all." Number 2, sheep are defenseless. There's many other animals that have a means of defense. Sheep might be able to run. They might be able to do some things like that to escape something that is pursuing them. Dogs, bears, lions, all those type of animals, they have a defense that they can use to protect themselves. Sheep, not so much. They have very little defense. And Jesus said in Matthew 9, verse 36, he looked out and he saw the multitudes, and he said he was moved with compassion on them because they fainted and were scattered abroad as sheep having no shepherd. I guess the third point that stood out to me as I studied, and I came across this in my studies, but sheep are not meant to carry heavy loads. And as you watch a group of sheep, you never see them pulling a wagon. You never see them doing something physically heavy. And this morning in devotions, and they read from Matthew 11, verses 28, and 29, where it talks about leaving it says, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." In Psalms 55, verse 22 also it says, "Cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee. He shall never suffer thy foot to be moved." As I thought about that, as we think about life, how often do the load of life weigh us down? The responsibilities that we have, the uncertainty of the future, the uncertainty of what we may face, fears of the future, failures of the past, discouragement, things that happen to us that seem like we can't forgive or forget, bitterness and injustice, at least the way we perceive it to be. Those kind of things can bog us down, and we can get discouraged. They seem so heavy. They can seem so distracting. Jesus said, "Bring them to me. Let me take care of them. I will give you rest." It's a promise. We are not meant to carry the load of sin. We are not meant to carry the things that bog us down. I realize we need to face them. We can't just go through life and pass them off. It is a reality. Those types of things are reality sometimes, but Jesus wants to help us with them and to take our load off our shoulders so that we can find life and that we can experience spiritual rest. Number 4, sheep know their shepherd's voice. I mentioned that earlier. It is said that the sheepfold, many times there were different flocks within the sheepfold. Different shepherds would bring their flocks to the sheepfold to protect them at night, to protect them from bad weather, so on. And in the morning, or when it's time to go back out to pasture, the shepherd would just need to call his sheep, and they would know his voice, and they would come out and follow him. How do we know the voice of the shepherd this morning? Well, I think it was already referred to this morning that a very important way, a very basic way, is to read our Bible, to know what the Scripture says, and to know what it says and to apply it to our lives. John chapter 10, verses 25 to 30. Not only do the sheep know the shepherd's voice, but the shepherd knows his sheep. In verse 25, it says, Jesus answered them, I told you, and you believe not. The works that I do in my Father's name, they bear witness of me. But you believe me not, because ye are not of my sheep, as I said unto you. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. And I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish, neither shall any man pluck them out of my hand. My Father which gave them me is greater than all, and no man is able to pluck them out of my Father's hand. It's a comfort to me to know that not only can I know the shepherd's voice, but the shepherd knows me. The shepherd knows you. The shepherd knows each one of us if we are faithful to him. If we have entered in by the door of the sheepfold, he knows you and I. Number 5, sheep settle for less. You know, sometimes they say that sheep will take whatever is fast and easy. You know, if they have been traveling or if they have been following the shepherd, they get to a place, maybe they're thirsty, there's a puddle of water there, they will drink that water that is easy to get to. The shepherd is always on the lookout for that, because, you know, sometimes what is fast and easy to access for the sheep is not what is best for them. In Psalms 23, verses 1 and 2, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. The shepherd knows what is best for his sheep, and he takes them to the areas that promote safety and health as he leads them. Now, the second part of the message, I'd like to look at some characteristics of the shepherd. Number 1, Jesus said he is the door. In John 10, verses 7 through 9, we read these verses. Verse 9 says, I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved and shall go in and out and find pasture. He is the door of the sheepfold. You know, doors are significant. Doors are an access point. You know, there's many miles that were traveled this week to get here for this service. And I don't know where you're from this morning, but nevertheless, we all started somewhere. I started in Northeast Ohio this week on Monday. And today I came through the same door you did to get into this room. You know, Martin Luther, at the beginning of the Reformation, he nailed his 95 Theses to a door because it was a place where people could come, where people would congregate and they could read. They could read what he had to say. Doors are significant. And there's other doors throughout the world too that have significance, that hold value. But the door of the sheepfold this morning, I believe, is the most important door that you and I will ever pass through. And we can go have other illustrations as well, as far as doors of borders of a country. You know, no matter where we come from, we cross a border into a country in just a couple lanes wide. The sheepfold was a walled-in area. It was often made of a stone wall that was around 4 to 6 feet high. And like I said earlier, it was a place where shepherds would bring their flocks at night or in other times, bad weather, to keep them safe. And it is said that the shepherd would often lie down in the doorway at night to protect the sheep. There was nothing that could come into the sheepfold without, first of all, crossing over the shepherd. And the sheep could not leave the sheepfold without the shepherd knowing it. He was the one that protected the sheep. And I like that to think that as Jesus calls himself the door, he's not only the access point, but he's one that guards the sheepfold. He only allows us to come into our lives what we can handle. And he will not allow you to leave. You cannot leave the sheepfold without him knowing it. He knows his sheep. And it doesn't really matter what our background is or what our history is. The door of the sheepfold is the same for every one of us, regardless of who we are and where we come from this morning. The door of the sheepfold is the same for each one of us. We meet the same conditions to enter into the sheepfold. Romans 3 verse 23 says, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." We all have sinned. We are all sinners. We are all sinners that are saved by God's grace. We each have that choice this morning if we are going to enter into the sheepfold. The door is open. Jesus is there, and he's ready to lead each one of us into a life of service for him. He wants to give us that spiritual life, that spiritual rest that we talked about this morning. You know, we talk about the future and so on. Jesus knows what we can handle. He knows what is best for us, and he will only give us what is good for us, that will bring us closer to him. Number 2, the Good Shepherd meets the needs of his sheep. I like the thought of Jesus being the door. He is the entrance point. He's the one that guards what comes in and out. But he's not only the door, and that is all, but he's a shepherd. And I don't know what a shepherd, the word shepherd, the term shepherd means to you, but to me, it talks about it speaks to me not only of an entrance point, but as someone that daily walks with us. That leads us on a day by day. He can meet their need because he has intimate knowledge of them and loves them. It is said that the love of the shepherd towards his sheep was best seen in times of uncertainty. You know, sometimes they would need to move from pasture to pasture. They would need to move to different areas to find enough grass for his sheep to feed on. And at times to get to those places, it required a somewhat of a time of journey, to time of walking, and they would have to sometimes cross streams, rushing streams. And it is said that the sheep that were right around the shepherd, as the shepherd stepped into the stream to go across, the sheep that were right next to him would boldly enter that water and cross over. And he said sometimes others that were a little farther away would be a little more fearful. They would go in very hesitantly and into that water to cross. The young ones, that sometimes there were young lambs that would get into the water and be swept away. And maybe some would find their footing downstream and struggle ashore. Still others would be swept away, and he would have to enter into the water again to save those sheep, to save the lambs. And the shepherd knew the importance of keeping each sheep safe, each lamb safe, because he realized that the success of his flock depended upon the weak, depended upon the young. And he would do what it took to save them. In verse 10 of chapter 10, it's probably one of my favorite verses in the Bible. And because of the comparison that it gives between a thief and the shepherd. The thief cometh not but for to steal and to kill and to destroy. I am come that they might have life, and they might have it more abundantly. The shepherd knew where to take to take his flock so that they would find the necessary food to sustain them. Jesus also gives us what we need to sustain our lives. And the thought of this abundant life. In the United States Declaration of Independence, it says all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and their pursuit of happiness. You know, we appreciate this country, don't we? We appreciate many things about this country and the freedoms. We appreciate many things about our government and the fact that we have freedom and that we can be a free people. But as we think about finding life, I think it's interesting, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. While that is a blessing in this country, yet finding true life, is that all about attaining physical things? We know what the answer is, don't we? Well, those things are necessary to a degree, yet to find fulfillment, to find life beyond those things, takes something that is much deeper than things. It is finding fulfillment, finding satisfaction, finding rest in Jesus, in the true shepherd. Number 3, the true shepherd gives his life for the sheep. In verses 11 and 18 of chapter 10 that we read, I am the good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. And verse 18, no man taketh it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, I have power to take it again. This commandment have I received of my Father. This was a voluntary sacrifice that Jesus made. He was not compelled in any way to make this sacrifice, but rather he made this sacrifice because of his love for mankind. And it's because of our choice to fall away from him that he had to do it. But yet he was willing to do it. And in verse 16, it talks about these other sheep that he has. And this morning, I believe that's talking about you and I. He was talking to a group of Jews here. But other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd. The reality is that there is one fold, there is one shepherd, and that's Jesus Christ. And he wants everyone to experience life within that fold, experience rest within the fold, the sheepfold. It is said that when a shepherd in his work, sometimes a sheep would wander off. They would get, I guess, inquisitive, and they would wander off. And he said they would often use a slingshot to shoot pebbles out towards those sheep that were wandering, to get their attention and to bring them back, and to help them realize that they were getting too far away. Does God bring things into your life? Does he bring things into our lives to get our attention at times? Where are we in our walk with him? Finally, the last point I have, Jesus' mission to his followers. And this might not be quite in this chapter that we read. But as I think about finding life in the sheepfold, finding life as we let Jesus lead us. In Matthew 10, verse 16, it says, Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves. You know, we as people that choose to follow Christ are called the sheep of his pasture. And what does the reading say that what we read this morning? It talks about thieves. It talks about hirelings. And here in Matthew 10, it talks about wolves. That's the reality, that as we live our Christian life, we find challenges, we find danger to walking with Christ. But the thought that stands out to me is that we can still find life, we can still find rest in the midst of these dangers. Again, the verses in John 10, verses 27 through 29, 3 things that protect and identify the sheep. Number 1 is they know the shepherd's voice. 2, the shepherd knows them. And number 3, they follow the shepherd. They live in obedience. And if you take any one of those out, we will not find protection. We will not find life in the shepherd. And it's a challenge to me as I think about living in the care of the Good Shepherd, is the fact that, we must have all 3 of these in place as we think about, as we consider finding our rest, finding life with the Good Shepherd. Finally, in verses 28 through 29 of John chapter 10, we have a promise. In verses 28 through 29, it says, I give unto them eternal life, and they shall never perish, neither shall any man pluck them out of my hand. My Father which gave them me is greater than all, and no man is able to pluck them out of my Father's hand. That's a comfort to me, as regardless of where God leads each one of us, regardless of what he has for us in life, regardless of what we face, we are safe within the sheepfold as long as we keep our trust in Christ, as long as we know his voice, as long as we follow the shepherd, and Christ knows us. And I let that as a challenge for myself and for all of us, that we would keep these things in mind, that as we know the voice of the shepherd and as we follow him, he will lead us and keep us in his care. Why don't we stand for a word of prayer?